All right, good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for coming to today's reading meeting. Today we are going to be focusing on the article by Eyimba Maduka titled "On How to Do African Philosophy in African Language, Some Objections and Extensions." So just to summarize very briefly the contents of this article, we find Dr. Maduka arguing for what he calls Afro-lingualism, right? And in his view, he suggests that African philosophers ought to in an African language. And the reason why this is so is because beyond being a means of communication, carry out culture and identity. And if that is the case, doing philosophy, African philosophers doing African philosophy in English language, that is a language that carries European or British culture and heritage, would be problematic if you're trying to, project ideas from the African place. So he suggests that we do African philosophy in an African language. Now, the challenges with such a proposal is quite obvious. On the one hand, you have the multiple ethnic groups, multiple language groups within the continent, Africa, and it is unclear how to choose which language would suffice as a tool for African philosophy. And this has been a problem for people like Kwasi Wiredu and Ngugi wa Thiong'o in their own proposals. But Dr. Maduka goes a step further. He suggests that African linguists, scholars of African languages, ought to come together and sit on a round table and create a new African language, one that philosophers can use to philosophize or do African philosophy. Okay. Of course, one might say that might be a very difficult task for one to accomplish. But Maduka Eyimba is convinced that since language is a man-made tool, it is not going to be impossible for human beings to come together and create new languages. And if that is possible, then his proposal ought to also be possible. And so that is the crux of Dr. Maduka's thesis in the article that we've all presumably read. Of course, there are some problems that I find with that proposal, and I'm sure some of you have certain questions and certain clarifications you have for Maduka as regards to his essay. One particular problem that I have is that when we create such a language, remember that Maduka earlier in his article had claimed that language is a carrier of culture, it's a carrier of identity. And I also suppose that language would also be a carrier of history. You can add that to what language carries. If all that is true, one wonders what type of history, what type of culture, what type of identity that a brand new contemporary African language would carry. That is something I can't seem to wrap my head around. Is it contemporary African history that has been, immersed and submerged into Western culture? Is it past pre-colonial African history? If it is, then how come we are using a new language, a brand new contemporary language to capture that history? The second problem I have with Maduka's proposal is that it seems such a proposal dissolves the variety of identities present within the African context. So when we create one language with which we use to philosophize and all that, other languages, other African languages would be subsumed, their identities, their cultures would be subsumed, or rather excluded from this contemporary language, because it will be something different from all these other languages. And if language identifies a people, and if, like the conversationalists say, identities are very important, contexts are very important, I fail to see how a new African language would preserve the vast previous histories, cultures, identities that are contained in the various African philosophy, various African language that we have today. So for me, those are the two main challenges to Maduka Ayimba's work. And on that note, I invite all of you to also engage with Dr. Maduka's article and his work, and try to draw out some of the ideas you find plausible and those ideas you think are implausible. So on that note, I invite you, raise your hands if you have any comments or questions for Maduka. Those who want to type on the chat box, that's also okay. All right, so who wants to go first? All right, Dr. Negedu, and after you, Dr. Evaristus.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for this session. I had earlier, obtained permission that I may not be attending, so I had to go into a car. So I'll quickly state my observations about the work. I'm interested in this for one reason. Of course, I've always thought of the possibility of what Dr. Maduka, proposed. But I've reading his work, made me have, of course, more interest, yet more challenges. But one of the challenges I want to state, which I think Maduka can help me out, is the fact that, his work suggests that when you do philosophy in foreign languages, it opens a door for you to reason within the within the context of thought of those foreign languages. And the worry I have is this, that I want to think that ontology or logic should be prioritized above language. So my issue is this, which you should help me out. If I'm going to be philosophizing, for instance, in Igbo language, or if I'm going to be philosophizing in Igbo language and I'm using, a foreign logic, then you have another scenario where I'm philosophizing in English language and I'm using an indigenous logic. The two are not the same. I think philosophizing using English language, but using an indigenous logic is more plausible. For me, I think it makes, the philosophy more plausible, reasoning from the African perspective, using the African logic. Now, but your work seems to suggest that it is language and not logic that is problematic within this context. But I think that logic and not language is more problematic. So I'm saying that if we are going to be using, if I'm using English language and I'm using an indigenous logic, then I think I'm philosophizing, you know, I think I'm doing African philosophy within that context. So I just want you to clarify, you know, these worries I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Negedu. Evaristus, I saw your hands up, and then after that, I'll give Dr. Maduka a chance to respond. And after he responds, we go to Dr. Umezurike. All right, so Evaristus.
All right, I believe I'm convinced that the author has been able to raise a serious issue that he perceives to be the problem of African philosophy. But then in line with the reading, it appears to me that the author is trying to reduce African philosophy to the status of a mere literary gene that we need to express in African language. His emphasis on the linguistic issue seems to make African philosophy to be a product of linguistics understanding instead of the ontology and logic as mentioned earlier. I will say that if we do African philosophy in the foreign language, but still maintain the concepts, because I understand that there are some certain concepts in African tradition that we cannot interpret in the foreign language, and we still maintain. For example, we use the English language to African philosophy.
Please, sir, can you kindly speak up? Can you speak up, please? We can barely hear you.
Okay, if we do African philosophy in the European language per se, then we still maintain those concepts that we cannot directly translate into English language. For example, I believe on conceptual decolonization instead of linguistic decolonization, because the process of linguistic decolonization will surely reduce African philosophy to a mere literary work, because the emphasis here is on the language, not the ontology. So I wonder how the author wants to embark on this process of Afrolingualism, because he did not tell us the nature and how we are going to do about it. Secondly, the process of learning language, we are born into the environment, and the language has been there before we thrown into the environment. So we learn this language as part of our experience. Now, creating a new language, the author seems not to pay attention to the process of learning this, even creating the language before learning it, because after creating this language, we need to learn the language in order to be familiar with the language before coming back to African philosophy. The implication of this is that writing African philosophy in African language, who is the targeted audience of this philosophy? Are we just doing it for Africans alone, or do we have the intention of projecting it to the other parts of the world? If we want to project African philosophy to other parts of the world, we must understand the fact that we need to translate it into the language that they will understand. In the process of translating this African philosophy, the meaning and other things might be distorted. So I don't feel that creating a language to do African philosophy will maintain the status quo of African philosophy. Instead, we can go with conceptual decolonization, a process in which some of those concepts that cannot be directly translated to European language will still be maintained in the African philosophy. For example, when Jonathan introduced his concepts on Jikoka and other concepts in Ezumezu logic, although he uses a European language to communicate his thoughts, most of those important concepts are still retained using Igbo language, and it gives a direct meaning, a similar meaning to those concepts, and that is okay. But for example, using Igbo language entirely to write the whole work, now he needs to translate it into another language that we understood by others. The meaning of his word and everything might be distorted in the process of translation. That is my worry about the project of Afrolingualism.
All right, thank you very much, Evaristus. At this point, I would invite Dr. Maduka to, respond to some of these challenges to his work.
Okay, thank you, Arabia, and thank you, colleagues, for your very penetrating questions and observations and comments. Let me start from what Arabia raised before Negedu and then Evaristus. Actually, the work in context is a work that is still is a proposal, and one can say still in progress. And so I actually do expect a lot of questions and disagreements, which I'm open to, look into, accept, and work on if I should wish to pursue that line of thought in my research. So I may not be giving you a final answer to your questions, but I will attempt to respond to them in form of conversations and ideas that we are all gathering together to help ourselves in our researches. So number one, Arabia said that if such language should be contrived, what type of culture or history can such a new language carry? Will it be the pristine African culture, or is it the contemporary one and all of that? I think that Afrolingualism, if it should come up, if it should take place, if it should happen, if it should be done, would be a carrier of both the pristine and contemporary culture, because one may wish to do a history of African intellectualism, African philosophy, African scholarship in general, in the language, and then make recount of some of these previous cultures. Just like one may want to write anything now, and then you take your mind back to the origin of a particular thing and begin to draw from the beginning to the point where you intend to, make your submission. And then, of course, at the point, this is a new idea coming up in this contemporary time, you would have as well carry the contemporary culture. And then embedded in that same question is a question of which culture. Wouldn't it cause an identity of one particular African culture to be eliminated, excluded, or subsumed in that one Afro-lingualism or Afro language? That's one other question embedded in those Arabia's question. I want to say that's actually the second question. When you say other languages will be subsumed or excluded, if we should go with that, that's actually your second question, Arabia. And my response to that is that in the work, I mentioned that Afrolingualism, in my thinking, as I was proposing, is supposed to be a combination of elements of all African cultures, all African languages, I mean to say, which implies that it's not just completely a new language coming from the blues. African languages, that's recognizing the multiplicity of languages and cultures in Africa, which is one of the major problems of proposing doing African philosophy in African language. To overcome such problem, we suggested that Afrolingualism should be a combination, a blend of elements. In other words, if you have, for instance, 365 languages in the entire African continent, for instance, assuming it is like that figure is so. So we may need to have a representative of an African scholar of language from each of these languages, forming the African language network, where elements of each of these languages will be integrated into the new Afrolingualism, which will eventually serve as the lingua franca of African peoples and culture. and a new language of philosophizing and doing intellectual studies. So in that case, no language will be eliminated. Every language will be involved, because it's not going to be a particular language that owns the Afro language, a particular culture or language that owns the African lingualism. It is a combination of all African language and culture that can be found on the continent, both major and minor culture and languages. You see, and again, I also mentioned in the work that it does not exclude the identity of all other cultures, that those individual particular languages still remains. It's like when you come to Nigeria, for instance, you have English language as our lingua franca, but we still have all our languages in place. When you go to some French countries, French seems to be the major language, but you see that there are still other particular cultures and languages that are still being used. So it is not going to exclude or subsume all cultures under that, but there'll be a representative, so that giving every African culture and language a place and a sense of belongingness, so that Afro-lingualism will be seen as an African thing and not a particular culture thing. So coming to Negodu's question, I didn't quite get him, but if I got him rightly, he's trying to asking me to look at the relationship between language and logic. And he's suggesting that if we should go the way the work is proposing, the way I was proposing in the work, then we'll be emphasizing language over logic. Meanwhile, he thinks that logic should be emphasized over language. Well, if I understood him from that angle, I think that there's a very close relationship between language and logic. And in a part of that work where I was trying to show the relationship between language, culture, and thought, I made the point that language is actually very fundamental. And to my thinking, as against what he is suggesting, which I actually appreciate his perspective, I may have to look at it, but for me, I think that language is actually something that is at the foundation of logic, even. Because if you want to look at the meaning of logic etymologically, logic is drawn from the word logos, which means speech, or language, which means speech or thought. You see, so that speech is also language. So language is a fundamental aspect of logic. We can't be talking about logic without talking about language. So I feel that, and eventually, when we want to look at the nature of logic, as it were, you discover that even its ontological nature is embedded in language, because formulation of arguments and the propositions that make up our arguments in a logical formation is done in a language. And it doesn't matter the language. In logic, it doesn't matter the language. It could be German language, it could be Russian language, it could be Yoruba language, it could be English language. But language is intrinsic in and fundamental foundation of logic. So if we want to say emphasize logic over language, we would be we'll be placing the cart before the horse, in my thinking, because language is actually a fundamental aspect of logic. It's actually its foundation, So I think that this is actually the point to begin with. When we deal with the language of our logic, we will be dealing with the ontology and also the logic of our thoughts. So that's my response to Negudo. I don't know whether I've done him justice. And then Evaristo's response is hazy in my mind. I'm not sure I got him quite well, whether it's a form of observation or suggestion or question. So I really did not get it. If you could just recast this question in a plain language, I think I should be able to respond.
Okay, Evaristus, can you briefly recap your questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. Now, one of my concerns is that if you emphasize so much on language, how about the ontological aspect of African culture that lives as a foundation to African philosophy? Then secondly, if we do African philosophy in African language, who are the major targets of this African philosophy? If it is granted that the target is not only the Africans and we want to project African philosophy to the world, are we not going to make it accessible to them by trying to translate it to another language? Then in the process of this translation, some vital aspects or meaning might be distorted. And I'll say that I seem to agree with conceptual decolonization, and I use the example of Chima Akonam's work on Izumezu logic, especially on those principles, in which he used English language to write the work. Then those important concepts that cannot be directly translated into the European language, he still maintains them in Igbo language, giving the nearest meaning to those words, like onenetity and other principles of which he explained. So by doing so, the concepts, those concepts in African tradition that cannot be translated into the European language due to distortion of meaning are still maintained, but the meaning are given. So the problem of Afrolingualism, I also mentioned the issue of learning language. When you create this language, you need to learn them. And this language are not the artificial language, they are not natural now to man. It becomes artificial. What will be the process of learning this language? How are we going to create this language? How about the concepts of linguistic behaviorism? How are we going to do about those in order to use this language in African philosophy?
All right, thank you, Evaristus. Let me start from the last one. That is, how are we going to create the language and how are we going to disseminate the ideas that the language is carrying to others? That's who are the audience of such language. In the work, I stated how I thought that I proposed how I think, how I thought that the language could be, formulated, and then by African scholars that are all interested in language and linguistics to come together and then, of course, brainstorm. It may not be an easy thing, and it may not be something that will happen in a twinkle of an eye. It will take some processes systemically, and then it can come to birth, But again, to answer the question of how are we not going to have a problem of interpretation and all that if you have to use it? And how do we learn it? Part of all that you asked. I mentioned also that since language is something that is humanly configured, it is also very possible, and that's actually the reason why we can learn new languages and relearn new languages. We can learn and relearn and even unlearn languages, So I made reference to the fact that if, for instance, any of us, the African scholars, wish to go to any European country and study, most times if you want to go there, they will demand that you learn their language. If you are going to the Netherlands, you may be expected to learn Dutch language. If you are going to Germany, you may be expected to learn German language. You see, if you are going to Spain, you'll be expected to learn have an idea of some level of Spanish language in order to be able to do your intellectual work. Sometimes you might even begin to write in such languages. How difficult does it, how long or how much does it take to learn those languages? If we can learn European languages, we can also learn the new language that is being contrived by the Africans. And then I was calling on Europeans to also reduce this the idea of what Chimakonam and Freta is doing now on Spartanism, superiorism, of thinking that their language is superior to African language and expect that we learn it, why they cannot learn ours. So when we have this general, unified, or unanimously arranged or contrived African language in the name of Afro-lingualism, Africans are supposed to, express the same conscientiousness, readiness, and willingness to learn the language the way we learn foreign languages when we go to their clients, and use it to do philosophy or intellectual work. Otherwise, we will continue to make them feel that their language is more superior. You see, now, again, if you remember the work of Wittgenstein, Tractacus, his original work, first publication, was written in German. And so it is with some of these most European scholars. And then it was then that they wrote in their languages, even though there were translations in English that made us to come to know about it. But when they were writing it in their language, they were not bothered about who would read and see that. So when we write in our language, this Afro-lingual language that is being proposed, first, the Africans themselves that have contrived it would have to learn it and begin to use it in writing. And then, of course, there will be a time where there might be a need, necessarily be a need. There might be need to translate in English language for all to also come to know. But let's begin the homework from home. And again, to see if I can answer that or your first question that is still not very clear to me, which is the question of ontology and language. I think it's close to what Negodu was saying, which I had tried to respond, that you cannot remove the fundamental nature of language when it comes to logic, because you can't do logic without language. Language is at the foundation of logic. Even the ontological aspect of logic is language. You can't talk about logic without talking about language. After all, logic itself is drawn from the root word of language, speech and thought.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Maduka. But just before you go, maybe you can respond to this comment by Ofuasia, who says, may you please provide an instance how language may be unlearned?
Well, when I said that we can learn and relearn, learn and relearn, learn and relearn. I'm not sure I use the word unlearn.
You did, sir, but let me help you. Let me help you out here. I'll give Ofuasia an example with myself.
Okay. Right.
So having spent much of my time in South Africa speaking English, I've discovered that certain terms from my local language, I no longer remember some of them. And sometimes it's difficult when I try to recall some of those terms, some of those phrases in my language, mainly because I have spent the better part of the year speaking English all through. So I think it is possible to unlearn a language, even though not within the space of 2 days or 1 week. I mean, I think over time, when one begins to, speak other languages and not constantly remind himself of the other language, which would eventually go out of his mind, or the unlearning process begins. And so you start by losing certain terms, certain words, not remembering it, and all of a sudden you wake up one day and discover that you cannot speak your language as fluently as you could before. That is a process of unlearning. I hope that suffices.
It's not a conscious effort.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Okay, I think from your explanation and instance, the word unlearn, from what you explained now, is not an intentional act.
Exactly.
So, but learning, the word learning is supposed to be an intentional act. And that is why I am not comfortable with the word unlearning language. You understand? But you can learn and relearn because it's an intentional act. But from what you explained,
I think the point is, if it's possible to unintentionally slowly unlearn even your own language, it is possible to also intentionally decide to forget a particular language, you know.
Okay.
Yeah. But let's hear from other people so you can respond, Dr. Maduka. We will hear from Umezurike, then Nelson, and then Patrick before you then respond. So Umezurike, please, your comments.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Dr. Arabia. It's a very wonderful job done by Dr. Maduka. I must appreciate him because this issue of language is not something that is very easy to finalize. And many have deliberated upon it, and because of probably the nature of what we have already, that we are being westernized and all that, so it becomes very difficult to philosophize outside English language, so to speak. But then, I think in line, when I was reading Dr. Maduka's work, there was a place on his relationship between language and thought. In as much as I agree with Okolo, for instance, that he quoted that language is a vehicle or tool of thought. I disagree with Dr. Maduka that language is a determinant of a person's thought. The reason is very simple. If we agree that language is a determinant of a person's thought, are we saying that one cannot just ponder about a particular thing without communicating it? So I was troubled when I got to that place, and that saying that language is a determinant of a person's thought. One can ponder over some certain things without necessarily communicating it, or probably bringing it out, as case may be. That's that on that. Another one is on the issue of what is said to be different between his Afro-lingualism with that of linguistic or conceptual decolorization of Weredu and that of Ngugi. I think he made a very sharp point there, because I think most of them, like he rightly said too, or thought that it doesn't necessarily matter whether we're philosophizing or doing African philosophy in an African language. It can be, you can use any language in doing so. The most important thing is that some concepts, should be used and all that, or the Western concept should be, indigenized in doing African philosophy, maybe for easy comprehension and all that. I think he did a good job there, but I have a little worry. Though I'm not going to talk about, what many people have already said. Dr. Arabia pointed at it, and even Dr. Maduka in his reaction to some of the questions equally, dealt with that. The issue of maybe considering the fact that Africa is a continent with linguistic diversity, which language, considering the multifaceted nature of the different languages we have in Africa, which language are we going to use in doing this African philosophy or in philosophizing within the African culture? I think it's a very big problem. it cannot be swept under the carpet or floor, just like that. Dr. Maduka was very, kind of smart to have said that, of course, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can learn and relearn, using Dr. Maduka's word. But for me, anyway, nothing is impossible anyway. But I don't think it will be very difficult because are we going to philosophize using Igbo language, Yoruba language, or other languages of other countries and all that? So for me it will be very difficult. For me it will be very difficult. And on that note, I say that even though Dr. Maduka talked about network, African language network, which is very okay. Of course, how we can probably conference and then see how we can go about it. We can start from somewhere. I think that's actually what Dr. Maduka is trying to point out, that it may be difficult, it may seem to be difficult, but we can start from somewhere because, of course, we cannot, journey of wonder might start with a step. But looking at it critically, the conference and all that, are we saying that maybe after the conference, how do we, go about having a unified language, not just an African language? So to say, are we going to have a language called maybe a universal, like what is happening in Cross River State, for instance, where we have different languages, where they said some male counterparts speak different language from female counterparts and all that. I don't think how they did it, though it was possible because I have learned that there is something like that in other Cross River State, for instance, where there are different languages, where men counterparts, even as a husband, you may have a different language from the one your wife, probably is speaking, and eventually have probably a point of convergence, a point where we have a general one, where probably if we talk A, we understand, and B, we understand, and all that. So my thinking is that what he's saying is a very good thing, but is the possibility or plausibility of his advocation is what I'm looking at. No, it is good we're talking about it. But then another thing is that I was worried because if you remember about the great debate, and then about the existence of African philosophy, and then the question about the existence of African philosophy, and then where we are today, where at least to a reasonable extent, many will believe that there is African philosophy. So if you remember what we passed through in trying to convince people that African philosophy exists. So I'm talking about, when we talk about this issue of language again, we are not saying that we should stop pressing because of how people will look at it. But if we're talking about language, if they've all accepted that African philosophy exists, which I know it is, it will be difficult for us to start talking about language, how to do African philosophy, in an African language at this point in time, when at the point of trying to convince and then see how we can, make more points, for them to understand that African philosophy exists. So, and again, I said, considering this Dr. Maduka's African language network, if we actually, succeed, for instance, maybe after conferencing, after, talking to ourselves, and after agreeing that we need to, do African philosophy in an African language, I expected Maduka to have delved into what we see to be the content, or better put, the syllables or the curriculum or curricula of this, thing he's projecting. What do you think will serve as maybe syllables and curriculum or curricula to this your projection? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mezurike, for your comments. I'll now call on Nelson to also provide his comments or criticisms. Nelson, if you're there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I never knew you had called. It was already my time. Well, let me just go straight to the point because it appears the previous speaker has said quite a lot, and then there are so many persons who have one or two things to say. In as much as I would like to applaud Dr. Maduka for this great work, there are some salient areas that I find a little bit problematic, which I would like him to react to. Now, in page 33, second paragraph, he was talking about those we categorize as emerging from that are African descent, people of African descent that should unite together, philosophers, scholars, and what have you, to come in the African language network. He mentioned African, those that within the category of African descent. I will come back to that. Then in page 29, he was trying to talk about the relationship between language, thought, and culture, but failed to actually espouse on the relationship between language and thought, but rather focus on discussing the relationship between language and culture, thereby omitting thought itself. And I find that as a little bit problematic. So my issues now with this work is, first and foremost, it is my own opinion, and which I believe the author can maybe clarify. I see this whole issue about the language question in African philosophy. There's something we are forgetting, and that is the fact that the author has not been able to, the author took it for granted actually, that there is a need to define who an African is. This is what I begin to see. It's a problem with works on African philosophy and some of all these language questions. Who is an African? I still come back to the question of identity, because you are taking it for granted that we all understand, we all have a unanimous agreement as to who an African is. And then Dr. Egbai, in one of their works on the Africa as a racial slur, a kind of expunging the name African from the African continent. One of those papers I read, they were arguing that the concept Africa is a colonial concept, which must also be done away with. Now, if you are talking about an Afro-lingualism using in an African language, the question is, who is an African? Now, those that you argue that we form the All-African language network, those categories of scholars, philosophers, theorists, and what have you, that you brought together to form the African language network, person that determines who should be in that class of individuals. That's the question I'm worried about, because now, are we saying that those individuals that form that African language network, are they not biased in themselves? Can they be totally free from their own biases in an attempt to conceive that Afro-lingualism or Afro-lingual language, or what have you, which will become a general language for addressing issues on African philosophy? No, so this is the problem which I would like you to address. And apart from that, it was Foucault, if I'm not mistaken, that argued that every translator is a traitor. By that, in an attempt to try to conceive a general language, a unanimous language for doing African philosophy, I think that language itself must be subject to some kind of biases, because we cannot totally purge any language from our own cultural biases, from our own individual biases, because no matter how much you try to bring up a language that is unanimously acceptable, that language itself will be faulty. Take, for instance, in historical past, the colonial, before the advent of the colonial masters came into Africa and colonized Africa, they came through fellow Africans. They communicated. It was what the colonial masters were saying to their fellow Africans, with which they were able to colonize Africans, whether with their language, with their religion, and stuff like that. So I think it's important for you to dwell and possibly in subsequent work to look at the question of who an African is. And how do you conceive an African? Who is an African? An African is an African necessarily somebody who is from an African descent, or somebody who, though it was born and bred up in Africa, but he went abroad to study. So how do we decipher or distinguish who an African is and who an African American is, and what have you? So these are some of the issues that we think. So I have others which I will look at later as we progress in this work. So I think you could just look at some of these things and maybe react to some of the questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Nelson. Patrick, you can go next briefly so that we can allow Dr. Maduka to respond.
No, briefly, please. I want to talk for 1 hour, 30 minutes. Thank you. All right. First off, I think I have some issues with the paper, but it seems I'm having more issue with Evaristus now than the paper. The idea that when we translate philosophy from African languages into other languages, let's say German, Mandarin, and the rest, meaning would be lost. The first question we should answer is, how did we get to read many of the philosophical works we are reading today, which were also translated? How much of meaning was lost in the cost of that translation? So we know that, I don't know if there is any, but most German philosophers wrote their ideas in German, and then they were translated into English for us to read. The same with the Greeks, and then the same with those in the Italian, the Latin, and most works in also Arabian Islamic philosophy, and the English, and many other cultures. So China, for example, today, because China has adopted Mandarin as the official language of China, does not mean that Mandarin is the only language that is spoken in China. The people in Shanghai, in Canton, have different languages. They speak different versions of Chinese languages and all that. But as a country made up of like 1.5 billion people, they adopt one language, which is the official language. And I believe every Chinese can speak or relate, write in that language. So it does not imply that because there are many languages, it becomes totally impossible for a country or a region to adopt one of the most dominant or popular language there. Other languages will still exist and be preserved. And then the idea of meaning being lost, certain concepts also being lost. If it is lost in African language or whatever language we choose to adopt, it also means that many of the words we translate from German into English, French into English, and all those words, it means meanings were also lost. So it is not something that would be exclusive to the African language that we choose to adopt at the end of the day. And the idea that when we also write in an African language, that what audience are we communicating to? First, Evaristo should answer the question, when the Germans were writing in German, what audience were they communicating to? When the French were writing in French, were they communicating to the French audience? How did he get to read about these ideas and know about them? So is it something that is it only when Africans write in African languages that the whole world begins to have a problem, or it is something that applies to every other region of the world? So those kind of limitations are not limitations at all in my view, because it applies to every other language and every other civilization. The basic grasp I have with the whole idea is basically in Africa, unlike in Europe, where countries are divided, almost every country have a language that majority of the ethnic groups in that particular region speak and all that. Africa, like Omezurike highlighted, even within communities, there are language variations and all that. That is where the problem is. But it is not totally impossible that we can have dominant languages that we can adopt. But the problem is, who decides this language? How do we create this language without some people feeling excluded? That is the problem. If we decide, let's say in Nigeria, for example, we go with the 3 dominant tribes and say, okay, we can adopt Hausa, South Africa has, I think, 11 official languages. So let's say in Nigeria, we adopt the 3 dominant. Sorry, please. Let's say in Nigeria, we adopt the 3 dominant languages, which is Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo, and then say, let's philosophize in those languages. The question is how other ethnic minorities will feel that their language is not included, because everybody wants self-preservation and want themselves to be heard or known. And aside the problem of deciding which language to adopt, the second one is conceptual. Dr. Maduka, specifically when you talk about Afrolingualism, I think when we use ism, we are mostly referring to an ideology. So shouldn't it be something like Afrolingua or something else than ism? Afrolingualism suggests an ideology, like when we say conversationalism is different from complementarity. Ism means the ideology or the whole philosophical school of thought of conversational thinking. So when we add ism, then that becomes an ideology more than a concept. That is it for now. I didn't use 1 hour at the end of the day, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for your contribution. So I will now hand over to Dr. Maduka Eyimba to give his response. And then when we come back, we will hear from Gideon. And I think Mary Alike's hand was up, so if she still wants to ask a question, she would then ask. But first, let's listen to Dr. Maduka speak.
Okay, thank you again, Arabia, and Umezrike and Nelson, and of course, Patrick. Umezrike is said is not in agreement with the fact that somewhere in the work, I suggested that language is a determinant of reality, and then he was trying to ask what if one has contemplated some form of thought but did not express it in a language, what happens? Well, my response would be that thought is actually arranged or patterned in a language. So when one reflects over a thing or contemplates some form of thought and did not express it either by action or symbols or language, then the question would be, was there any thought? Of course, the answer might be yes. One had thought something but kept it to his or herself. But it means it's a personal reflection that is not meant for others to participate in. And so that's why if it is not expressed in language, either symbolic language or propositional language as we have it, or even in action, which is part of the expression of thought, then we may not be bothered about that particular thought. So, but when we bring in thought and its relationship with language, it simply means that our thoughts and reflections are expressed in language form, either symbolic language or propositional language. And language is actually a tool for communication of our thoughts. And so if thought is not communicated in any of these forms of language, it means such thought is not originally intended to be expressed or originally intended others to participate in. And so we may not bother ourselves with that. That's what I may wish to answer Muzrike in that aspect. But where we are talking about communication of ideas, communication of thoughts, what's the means of communication? The means of communication is actually language. It might be symbolic language, it might be sign language, it might be propositional language. But language is actually there to express or carry these thoughts. You know.
Sorry, sir. Sorry, sir. My question was that you wrote that language is a determinant of a person's thought. That word underscored, that word determinant. And I was not saying that it doesn't necessarily mean that probably if I ponder over something, I could not communicate it, express it via language, that such a thing have not been thought of. That's what I'm saying. The word determinant, language is the determinant of thought. Somewhere in your work. I accept that as a tool, I accept that as a vehicle, like Okolo would have it, but not that is a determinant of a person's.
Dr. Maduka, are you there? I don't know if you heard Dr. Mezurike's last comment before it went off. You're muted, sir.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, he still, what if I still understand him? What he's saying is that I said that language is a determinant of reality. I mean, of thought, of a person's thought.
Of a person's thought.
Yeah. Is that not? And you are
And I'm saying that it can serve as a tool or a vehicle, not like Okolo would say, but is it necessarily a determinant? But if you say something determines something, you are saying that something caused something to happen. And I'm saying that that one can still think, you understand, without expressing what his thoughts via language.
All right. I understand what you are saying. The fact is that there are two senses in which that statement was made. One is what I had explained already. All right. Then the second part, which I think is what you are pointing to, is the fact that it's going to be a little bit controversial. Some people may not accept that, but Arabia had hinted to it earlier. And that's the fact that it seems to me, at the time of writing this work, I might wish to rethink all of this. At the time of writing this work, it seems to me that we think in a language. And this is the reason why I was thinking that there's a need for us to look at the language with which we express the thoughts that led to all of these things I'm proposing in this paper. Okay. Does it not seem so? For me, it does, that we think in a language. As I'm trying to explain what you are saying or answer your question, I'm thinking it in order to talk about it, but I think that I'm thinking in a particular language. But what language is it that I'm thinking? Maybe because I was schooled in English language, and I've been doing my research work and my schooling and scholarship in English language. I could be thinking in English language, and that could make me mentally an European or an Englishman. And we have a problem. I don't want to digress to that because it will create a lot of controversies. But when I say that language is a determinant of thought, I am actually referring back to the relationship between language and thought. And the fact that apart from language being a vehicle to express our thoughts, language is there, primordially, in the minds of a thinker as he thinks. For instance, in my mind, I could reason it that Chuma Okonnam thinks in his, I may be wrong, that makes it possible for him to always be quick to have quite a lot of Igbo ideas and concepts that are expressed, even proverbs. He's well versed in that. I'm an Igbo man, but I'm not versed in Igbo proverbs. But he's vast in all of those Igbo culture and proverbs. And it can easily come, it easily comes to him while he's thinking and reflecting on his work. It's only just the last work he presented yesterday that I didn't see him configure quite a number of Igbo concepts in the work. And that's the first time I'm seeing that. So in my thinking, that statement, I'm trying to refer to the fact that one thinks in a language, and language determines what the thought of a human before the expression. So language performs two functions here. It determines the thoughts, and then it also carries the thought, expresses the thought. Now, remembering again the relationship between language and logic, as I had explained earlier, you will easily now begin to want to agree with what I'm saying concerning language being a determinant of thought, because logic should be at the foundation of our thoughts. And we actually must have a logical pattern which we think, either in a two-value logic or trivalent logic. You see, which again refers to culture. You see now. So please, for me, this is what I mean. I think I was referring to when I made that comment, to answer your question. But I'm still open to.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Maduka. Let me just make a comment.
Okay.
I think Dr. Mezurike's point is still substantially important for you to think about. Because as he made those comments, I remember the certain individual, the very famous lady, I think her name is Helen Keller, if I'm not mistaken, who was born blind, deaf, and I think without the ability to speak, right? So it took her a while. It took her a while to eventually learn how to communicate, and she's a famous writer today, a famous novelist, I think. But the point is that for a long time, even into her teenage years, she did not have the ability to speak. I don't think she had the concept of language, but I would not think that she was unable to have thoughts, because not being able to have thoughts would mean being unconscious, and that's it. She wasn't unconscious. So I think it's possible for people to think, even if they don't think in language, they might think in their experiences, right? So you're not putting a name to an experience. What you're thinking of is the experience itself. That is a way of thinking that doesn't involve language. Even beyond that sort of example, there are instances where we have certain experiences. Could be pleasurable, it could be painful, and we do not have words to capture such a feeling or such an experience. We don't have the language to capture it. But when we think and remember that experience, we do think about it without a language. So it is possible, I think, for us to think without language. And if that is the case, if there is at least one instance where that is possible, then that betrays your claim that language is the determinant of thought. Perhaps something for you to think about as you move on. You can please respond to other people's comments.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Sorry, please. Apologies, sir. Dr. Aribia, please, sir. Doctor, please. I think the experience you are talking about, you must understand that experience in a language now. So you cannot just think about the experience and about the experience. That experience itself, it is encompassed in a language, maybe English language, Igbo language, or anything. So experience itself is the whole entirety of experience is understood in a language. That is why you can think about experience. So that is just
I'm saying that there are certain experiences that we cannot capture in language. Certain experiences we have that we cannot capture in language. Or even if there are no such experiences, even if we assume that such experiences do not exist. The case of Helen Keller is a clear example of where an individual can think without the language. All right, but let's not dwell on that too much. Let's allow Dr. Maduka to respond because we don't have much time anymore.
All right, Dr. Arabia, thank you very much. Like I said earlier, I am open to corrections and all of that. At the time of the writing of this work, these were my thoughts. But with these conversations, of course, there will be some rethinkings. I will take that into consideration. Then the second question that Ms. Vicky raised was, which language? This question had been asked earlier, and I think I've responded to that. And he was saying that in his thinking, it will be difficult to have a one language for all African continents. And I would simply want to add to my previous response that apart from the fact that I have already painted a picture of how this language will come up, it's not going to be a Yoruba language or Igbo language or Swahili and all of that. It's a combination of all of this. You know, no, if in Nigeria we have 20 languages, we should bring experts in each of those languages. In Africa, in South Africa, we have 21 languages. Bring experts in all of those languages. And then they sit together, and it's not going to be an easy thing. Like Mr. rightly said, it's going to be difficult. Yes, but it being difficult does not make it impossible once we put our mind to it. It's just like referring back to the great debate issue when African philosophy was said not to be in existence. If we had given up that to prove it or otherwise would be difficult, and then we didn't go ahead, we wouldn't be where we are today talking about African philosophy. And possibly Conversational Society of Philosophy couldn't have been born doing the exploit is doing today in the area of African philosophy in the entire globe. You see, so it is when we put our mind to it, and all of these scholars are on ground and willing to do this. Remember, it's a willing, consensus effort, and then we'll discover that it can be done. In one language can be brought up, and then we can begin to learn and relearn, and then the issue of which language will just, go away. Just like the issue of, is there anything like African philosophy died a natural death? As far as I'm concerned, it's dead and long buried. Anybody bringing it up now is living in the past. So these things can happen with time. It's not a one-day thing, it happens with time. So it's being difficult doesn't make it impossible. Then his next question is, what would be the content? What will be the content of such, and what will be the syllabus or curriculum of such language? Well, that's what the African Language Network is to do, to configure all of these, and for morphologists and grammarians who will be part of this from different parts of Africa, they are the ones to put up all of these, while we philosophers of language will also be there to bring our own idea to the table. You see, that's why there is a need for such configuration, some such gathering in order to come up with such. It's not going to be a one-day thing, a one-year thing and all of that. It's step by step until we come to it. Once we put our mind on it, we will come up with it. And then the African continent can have one language. This is what I am thinking, all right? So the issue of the content and syllabus can be done as we continue to have that African Network Conference or Language Network Conference from time to time with the aim of arriving at this Afro-Lingua language, and doing all of this. Then it will come up. Then to Nelson, I'm trying to be a bit fast because we've taken a lot of time. Nelson is of the view that I omitted thought in my attempts to show the relationship between language, thought, and culture, that I emphasize more on language and culture instead of thought. Well, I don't know how he read off that part. I think I did something there, but I will also take that into consideration and see how I can deepen that discourse on the relationship between language and thought. But I think I did in the work, but I could still go back, look at it, and then add some flesh to it in subsequent work. And then he also asked the question of he said that the major question we should be asking here that he expected that I should have raised is the question of who is an African, before talking about African language and all of that. He said that I took it for granted that who an African is well known. I think he is correct. I took it for granted, and in my mind, it wasn't actually part of the scope of my work, and that's because I felt that it would be to belabor an issue that is to be in a simple terms. In simple language, I took it for granted. So, because for me, during the great debate, this issue came up, who is an African philosopher. And there were so many things said by these scholars of the great debate, Bodurin, Hotonji, and all of these our people there, all of these scholars. Some were of the fact that, of the view that the African philosopher is one who is an African descent. Others were of the view that the African philosopher is one who writes on African philosophy and African experience, whether the person is an African or not. So all of these things I felt have been, overflogged. So I felt there was no need elaborating or bringing a subheading on discussing who is an African. So if at this point scholars do not know who an African is, I think it's an issue we should be talking about. Again, he mentioned the fact that some scholars have referred to the notion of African as being, not quite a plausible notion to use for people of our kind. I remember that also Chumakram in one of his works also is of the view that that notion African is not befitting for the African, especially the notion of black African is not plausible or good enough for us. So, but for me, I didn't see any need to go into that. That's why I ignored that. But if there's a necessity for it, maybe in subsequent work, I might wish to, dabble into it. Then the other one he said is that are the scholars who are going to sit together under the auspices of the African Language Network to discuss this, new language and bring it up, are they not already going to be biased? That's the question Nelson, his last question. For me, the issue of bias in any venture is not something we should, begin to, raise so much dust over. The reason is because we are all humans and we are value oriented, and which implies that we have some subjective, views and biases, So if one who is coming from Kenya is coming with his own bag of values and subjective ideas on how his language should be prominent in what is to be done, and another who is coming from Zimbabwe, another from Nigeria, another from South Africa, and all of that, coming with their various mindsets and biases, if I should use Nelson's word, to bring to bear on the discussion at the round table of the African Language Network of scholars. Of course, they will have their biases, but the discussion would continue to rage in a way that there will be disagreement and agreement, counter criticism and all of that until something is arrived at that everyone will be comfortable that we are represented, we belong. And that's why each of these languages ought to really have one person, one scholar, one specialist, from each of these language cultures represented in such a thing. Somebody said, how is it going to be? Until we kick it off and start a conference of such nature and call for papers, call for participation. Of course, you will see people who are interested in it that will come. And from there, it start expanding. It's something that can happen if we put our minds to it. You see? So, irrespective of the biases and values that one may come with, it will not prevent progress in the goal of such a gathering. Okay. For Patrick is of the view that who decides this language, who creates it for others not to feel alienated. I think I've answered that question already. If everyone is available from all climes and languages and cultures within Africa, and they have input and are comfortable at the end with what is agreed on, nobody will feel alienated. And the question of who creates it will not come up again because it is we that have created it and not one person. So, and then he suggests that I should have used Afro-lingua rather than Afro-lingualism, because that would be pointing to an ideology. I thank him for such suggestion, and I will look into that. Thank you very much for now.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Maduka, for your responses. So I'll take two more comments and critiques, specifically from Gideon, who had his hands up, and Miriam, who had her hands up a while back. So Gideon, if you still want to make your comments, please do so now.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you, Dr. Maduka, for your essay. It was quite clear. I have some issues that I want to put forward, and I'm going to like start discussing the first with just like a historical example. So David Hume, for example, who is said to be like the most important like philosopher who wrote in the English language, did not actually speak English originally. Like that doesn't seem to have been his first language. He's a Scotsman. They were conquered by England and all, but he at some point, even in his adult life, while philosophizing and all, devoted much of his time to learning English and writing and speaking in English. And also, he advocated that other people in society in Edinburgh and all should also do the same. And we see the same like attitude like expressed by like other like great prominent figures of the Enlightenment, of the Scottish Enlightenment, like Adam Smith and Joseph Black. So the point really is that they adopted English for certain reasons, and like it was because of the fact that English was like a language that had lots of literature on a lot of human like discoveries and like literature and like development, and they thought that this was like in a sense a culture that was much more sophisticated than ours, and we should like adopt it in order to get into like benefiting much from this already developed huge body of literature by other human beings who happen to be English. And that catapulted the Scottish like society to like from squalor to like becoming one of the greatest successes of the modern age and all that, and like contributing much like significantly to the Enlightenment as a whole and the modern world as we know it today. So like given this like background on how like people who like assumed a similar position to what we find as to what we later assumed like as Africans, people who were colonized by other societies and cultures, consciously decided that they were going to like take up the language of the other culture in order to advance themselves, even if the trade-off was that much of their culture, like Gaelic and all that, their language was like lost in the process. What do you have to say to the possibility that adopting the culture or the language of like the colonial masters like could even be something that's like truly valuable because of the opportunity that it affords like people who adopt it to like the huge amount of literature, the huge amount of like of human inquiry that has carried out in the context of that culture. That's the first issue. And then the second issue that I have is regards to the, I think this has been flagged earlier, but with regards to the possibility of the new language you're saying that we should try to like create, the possibility of it solving the problem that you set up at the very beginning. So your problem really is that you want a language that like doesn't lose the cultural categories of that exist in African different African languages. But like it's impossible for us to transpose all the different conceptual categories in the multiple languages that exist in Africa. Let's say in Nigeria, for example, we even have like seems to be over 200 languages. And how do you transfer all the conceptual categories there into this new language? It's impossible. It seems to me that it's impossible for that to be done. So even if we created this new language that you're proposing, we wouldn't have solved the problem that you set on to solve by adopting this strategy. So the question then for me is like, if let's say it's possible to create this language, but this language will not solve the problem that you say it's supposed to solve, why don't we just stick with speaking English as it is now, like, and with all the benefit that exists in whatever colonial language like people have access to, and like the robust like kind of engagement that's already happened in that language? Like, what's the trade-off that we're really like? Why is it that this new language is going to be better than the languages that we already have now, speaking English and at the same time perhaps speaking our local dialect, and maybe integrating some aspect of our local dialect to English, as we see happening all over the world, where, let's say, for example, in some Latin American countries, they speak Spanish, but also like with lots of like influence from the Italian language. So like language always developed with this sort of, you take from like your like English as spoken in Nigeria and is different from English as spoken in the West. So I just really, the trade-off it seems to be more on the balance of like adopting the colonial language that we've had access to. And historical example seems to like, I don't know, with the Scottish society at least, seems to support such a move.
All right, thank you very much, Gideon, for your contributions. I would then ask Dr. Miriam Alike to also make her comments if she still wishes to do so. Dr. Miriam, are you there? Okay, I don't think we can hear Dr. Miriam. So perhaps Dr. Maduka, you can just respond to Gideon's comment, and if we can get Dr. Miriam back online, then she would ask her questions, and then we close. So over to you, Dr. Maduka.
All right, thank you, Arabia, once again. And Gideon, thank you for your observations. I think that your two observations or questions are still referring to one thing. So I'm going to answer them as one. And that's, what do you think about adopting the colonial language instead of creating a new one? And then the second one is still, after all of the observation, you say, why don't we just stick to the English language because of its obvious benefits? So you are correct to a large extent, and many scholars are of the opinion that there is no need looking for any further language to use in doing philosophy and African philosophy particularly to prove any point. Whereas there are also some scholars who are of the view that, which is a group of scholars where I belong in my thinking, that we doing philosophy or doing African intellectual work in English language is also not helping the growth of our culture, and it's not actually showing our contribution to intellectual community, African culture and its contribution in intellectual culture, intellectual community. So to respond to your question directly, we may wish to stick to English language as we are doing already. It's not going to be something that could happen in a twinkling of an eye. Like I said, just in one first swoop, we move away from English language and start writing in the new language we are trying to propose, or in any new language. While we are writing, thinking, and doing scholarship in English language due to its obvious benefits, we are suggesting by this work that there is a need to rethink if doing such without any attempts to configure a language that could be African, would that allow the African cultural heritage to be projected to the world? And wouldn't we still be under wouldn't we still be subjective to the European superiors, as it were? So this work is just an attempt to point to the fact that there is a possibility, despite the fact that it might be difficult, as have been said, but this being difficult does not mean that it is impossible. So I think that while it is possible to stick to English language without bothering about what I'm talking about here and nothing happens, but there's a need to also look at the fact or the possibility of bringing up a new language that we can insist that those who want to read us should also study as we study their language, so that this issue of epistemic marginalization, epistemic injustice would also, continue to be reduced, as it has to do with the African intellectuals and African academics, African culture, as it were. So for me, while it is right, it is possible, we can go ahead with what we are doing already, without anything happening, and we just continue that way, nothing happens. But again, why, if we go ahead and form this network, go into these conferences over time and come up with a language, nothing will still happen. It will have its benefits and might eventually turn around to be something worthwhile that will bring further and expose further the glory of African culture and heritage. So whichever way, there's nothing wrong, but it is not bad trying to do what is possible to be done, you know. So that's what I can say for now.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Maduka. I don't know if Dr. Alike can try again to ask a question, since we didn't hear her the first time. Dr. Alike.
Hello.
All right, so it seems Dr. Alike is having difficulty with her audio. So I will just thank Dr. Maduka for engaging with us, you know, for answering our questions. And I also thank everyone for spending time today for this reading meeting. We look forward to the next one. Again, I encourage colleagues to send me their seminal work so that we can have a read of some of your ideas that you've published. And also encourage other colleagues who've not asked questions or commented to also begin to do so. We would like to see other colleagues engage with the works that we read. All right, so thank you, everyone. God bless. Have a great weekend. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone.